That was Brother Martin Pahinui, and I am Poka Lainui. Aloha Hawaii. Good morning. Today is the 22nd day of April.
I'm Roger Epstein and invite you to join with kindred spirits to map your own hero's journey to live the rest of your life in connection and service. Find out more at www.voyageofaloha.com.
Well, it'll be something interesting. I don't know if you've heard about this conference that is being held. And essentially what they're saying is, is there a role in Hawaii? Some people believe that Hawaii should be the centerpiece of the building a peaceful world. And so they're working with the Joseph Campbell Foundation and the whole idea of the hero's journey. How do we develop new stories or new mythologies to carry us forward? Or maybe exploring older mythologies. A lot of things to discuss, but that's not why you're here. So
it's a fascinating topic and something that is gaining a lot of traction worldwide, as far as not just Hawaii but indigenous people. Having the answers for the world's woes.
Well, one of the discussions we had, and this was just yesterday, was what's her name? Elizabeth Sahtouris. I don't know if you're familiar with Elizabeth. She wrote a book called Gaia, From Chaos to Cosmos, and she had been traveling in Hawaii about maybe 15 years ago. I had known Elizabeth from that earlier period. She's an environmental biologist, and so she traces more the historical, and what she's essentially saying is that the earth will take care of itself, whether or not man or however man works. Man may become extinct as a result of man's work, but the earth will continue to exist. And so she starts a story from the very beginning and traces ecological changes, and with that I suggested that we should also have the Kumulipo exposed about from the very beginning of time, the deep darkness, and from that all the different creations. And then you can move to the Chinese, the Wu Qi idea that everything was, that is, and will ever be, and out of Wu Qi comes Tai Chi, the division between yin yang principles, male, female, night, dark, and all that stuff, which is very similar to the Kumulipo. And then if you look at the book of Genesis,
same thing.
In the beginning was a word, whatever that was.
Right.
And then the generation.
And there was nothing. And then all of a sudden, everything was there.
And so the stories are, the mythologies are very, very similar.
Yes.
Some could say identical when you look at the basic structure of it. So I suggested that this be brought into this discussion so that we don't see just one opinion as being, or one theoretical formulation as being the only thing, but we see the commonality among many different people.
Right.
And we can bring you back some other time.
And one of the terms going around now is indigenous wisdom. And it's really true that there's truth there. It may not be a scientific kind of description what happened, but the truth is this is what happened, and this is how things are set in motion and are ordered. We live in an ordered universe.
Well, one of the things, you're carrying me into this discussion.
Well, I'm
just following up on this announcement. But I was responding to that idea by making a comparison. There's a guy named Atkins, or Aikenhead, that's his name, out of Canada, and he's studying indigenous wisdoms in terms of Aurora Borealis and the Indian explanation of what coyote is doing and all of the tricks that are occurring and all that stuff. Now, within the observable materials that they have, the theoretical formulation, the explanation that they have fits in. So they can explain exactly what Aurora Borealis is. From the Western side, they say, that's not so. It's because of, and then they build a different theoretical basis.
Right.
The thing is that Westerners tend to depress or degrade the interpretation of others, and yet their interpretation fits the formula just as well. Someone, at one time, an old man now, his name was Plato, who said, whatever you do, you got to save the appearance. You can build whatever theoretical model you want, but you got to meet the facts. And you cannot create your own facts.
Right.
Another way of putting it is you're all entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts.
That's correct. That's correct.
And I think part of the argument is that we cannot continue with the idea of superiority of themes. And then there was a Filipino guy out of the Philippines, University of the Philippines, Virgilio Enriquez, psychologist, who was saying we need to lift the integrity of indigenous wisdom and indigenous science, because the wisdoms that we have were very scientific. It was based on observation and contesting it and all that kind of stuff. So,
very good, fascinating.
Yeah. Well, we'll continue on some other time. I'm taking up your time.
No, that's okay.
So, tell me, Leon, what's happening and what you've been doing in the international arena.
Okay. I've been traveling quite a bit, of course, and like you, I've been participating in United Nations activities, and particularly fora that are open now to Native Hawaiians, or let's say to indigenous peoples generally, but also, of course, pressing our situation, which is not specifically an indigenous issue. Our situation in Hawaii is one of nationality, or one of seeking our self-determination, or restoring our self-determination. And so this is a message that I've been, as well as you and others before me, have been trying to advance at the United Nations. And I just have to report that we are actually making very good progress in the recent years, getting the ears of certain people. Now, the United Nations is kind of a sticky situation because, for one, it is a big not a governing, but an organization that makes policies and decisions and things like that based on their membership. And the stronger the member, the more that member has ways of manipulating the outcomes of whatever decisions are made. And we see that particularly in the Security Council of the United Nations, where 5 member states have veto power, But when you get to the General Assembly, then you've got 192 states that have 1 vote each. And so what we are angling for is to bring our topic, our subject, about Hawaiian independence, about decolonization. These are like UN terms, decolonization, self-determination. But what it really, for us, would lead to would be independence, the restoration of Hawaii's independence. So what we're bringing up to the UN is the fact that the United States violated a number of UN policies, the charter items, as well as mandates for decolonization. When the UN was formed, there were designations as to which countries were independent, were sovereign, and which countries were still colonized and or somehow not sovereign. And so these countries that were not sovereign were listed on a list of non-self-governing territories. And Hawaii and Alaska, lo and behold, were listed by the United States on that list. They were put onto that list. So the United States was actually admitting that they had no lawful basis here, that they were actually in the role of colonizers of Hawaii. And so everybody very magnanimously agreed that Hawaii and Alaska were not actual territories of the United States. They were non-self-governing territories. At that time, when the United Nations was formed, the non-self-governing territories were all assigned an administrative country to assist that territory into becoming independent, or to the point where they can decide how they want to proceed with their future governance. So they could be independent, or they could become a subsidiary or an affiliate to the administrative body. So Hawaii was not given the option. In 1959, the United States pulled off a scam and convinced the world and the United Nations that Hawaii and Alaska the same year had decided through a plebiscite to become member states, or domestic states of the United States. This was actually a gross misrepresentation of what actually happened here, in that there really was no choice, as we know.
Yeah.
So what we're doing is we're taking this issue back to the United Nations, saying that the United States violated U.S. mandates and the responsibilities for decolonization by conducting a phony plebiscite and then reporting to the United Nations to remove Hawaii and Alaska from non-self-governing territories, the list.
From the list of, okay.
And that's what happened. And what we want to do is to convince the United Nations not to recognize us or to do anything else, because that's our job to build our nation. But we're trying to convince the United Nations that they need to take measures or steps to reinstate us onto the list of non-self-governing territories. That brings the levels the playing field here. It brings us back to the point where we can determine what we want for the future.
I guess that's the umbrella term that we would call self-determination.
That's correct.
Within which we can choose sovereignty or independence.
Right.
And we can choose to stay with the United States as to be integrated with the United States, or to be in free association, some in-between status.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it would be we who determine what we want to be.
And the other question is, who is the we?
The we.
Yeah, because on one hand...
Who is the self in...
who is the self in self-determination? On one hand, there's one, I guess, extreme, that it's only the indigenous people, only the Po'i Hawaii. On the other hand, as the Americans have interpreted, it's anybody who resides within the territory at that time and who are American citizens. So that's another extreme. How does one define the we in your mind?
Well, the good thing is that when the United Nations was formed in 1940, well, first of all, there are laws. And there are international laws and international policies that have been developed over hundreds of years. You know, going back to the Law of Nations that stated what a nation is and who are its citizens, who are its people. And then since then, particularly since the founding of the United Nations, at the time the United Nations was formed, there were only 40 really recognized countries. And then now there are 192 members of the UN, plus many others that are not members. So we have well over 200 countries that have determined what a citizenry is, what their body politic is. So there are formulas and there are standards that are already set up that we can use. So it's not like we're shooting in the dark and trying to make up the rules ourselves. And the other advantage is that Hawaii was already an organized, internationally recognized country before the takeover. So we really have that option, or actually a very strong option of restoring that nation, which is already recognized, which through Keanu Sai's efforts and the paper that Dr. Matthew Craven wrote, you know, Hawaii is in continuity. It never surrendered. It never extinguished
looking
sovereignty.
at the issue of self. And of course, we are all familiar with the term nana ike kumu. You know, look to your source. And in this case, I would suggest that the source is one history. The source is also one culture of the people here. And taking from those two foundations, I would suggest that the history tells us that it's not a matter of race, but it's more a matter of relationship.
Yes.
And oftentimes we
That's
describe...
our style.
Yeah, that's right, the style.
Yeah.
And we would call people by their relationship to Aina, Aina being the land or the society that feeds us. And so Hoa Aina, Kua Aina, Kama Aina, Keiki Oka Aina. It's always that relationship to the Aina. And I think for a time when, during our occupation and learning through the American system, we had been brainwashed into seeing things through Americanized eyes. And when they saw the American Indians and called them indigenous, and then called the Hawaiians indigenous, we saw it through those racist eyes and saw it only as a matter of race rather than seeing it through the view of our kupuna.
That's right. We're allowing others to define who we are.
Yeah. And so in that, I think...
And it's an incorrect definition.
Yeah, and so part of that process of decolonization is for us to go back and examine some fundamental principles and then address it in that way. And not just leaving it in history or in culture, but also to use our own sense of humanity.
That's right.
And to apply those principles. You know? I think another way of seeing it is that in 1945, 1946, the formation of the United Nations, the development of this idea of non-self-governing territories, what they were talking about was the people who have been colonized and who are in the territory. Not the Americans who are by accident in the territory. They were talking about the colonial people and their right to exercise. So the idea of transmigration, of transmigrating the occupiers' members into your territory.
And in fact, that issue was brought up, of course, several times over the history of the formation of nations. And the most recent was, of course, in the Balkan states. In the Baltic states. And I believe it was Estonia that actually brought this question before the World Court because there had been many settlers, Russian nationals, that had been, particularly the military and their dependents. I think there were like 500,000 of them, or 600,000 settled in Estonia. So Estonia, before they voted on their a constitution and all that, basically they went to the World Court and said, well, who are the ones who are eligible to vote in our country? And they basically, the World Court said, it's the residents and the people of that country, not the settlers, not those that are brought in and that are transmigrating into the country. So 600,000 people were not eligible to vote.
In that particular case. There's another case, and that's in the Pacific, in Fiji. Because as Fiji was achieving its independence, and it was trying to describe who are the Fijians, they said it's a Fijians and not the Indian Fijians who are entitled to vote.
Who are actually about 50%, 50-50.
Yeah, 50-50. The UN stepped in and says, no, you cannot have...
Exclude
the rest. And they are really victims of colonization by the British because they came in for employment, and I don't know if over the years they then identified themselves as being part of this land, and their, you had generations of them having lived there, and their loyalty was not to India. They had very little connection, if any, to India. So in that particular case, the UN said, we are not going to allow this apartheid practice to develop, where a minority of Fijians now overrule the majority and the others cannot participate. And so situationally, I think it's also important to see. But with Hawaii and Hawaii's history, it'll be interesting.
And most of those Indians who lived there had been there for several generations, and they considered themselves Fijians, not Indians.
And then, of course, it's colored by politics within Fiji, and you have the Melanesian Fijians as opposed to the Polynesian Fijians. Fighting among themselves and
of course they're still under strongman rule.
The overthrows and all that stuff. That's interesting. But anyway, I diverted the conversation. And so, what is the progress that you see? And I'm sorry, we only have about maybe 7-8 minutes in the program.
Over the years, as I said, we've been pushing forth this particular idea that Hawaii was unlawfully inducted into the United States. And so that particular notion is beginning to gain some traction at the UN. And we're getting the attention of several committees from the Human Rights Council as well as others, to the point where they're beginning to start an investigation. But best of all, what's happening is that we've had access to describe our situation many, many times now at the UN to the member states. And again, I remind you, 3/4 of the member states were newly formed in the last 50 years.
Yeah, a result of decolonization.
Right. So
from the
they've
US.
gone through that process, and they are very, very sympathetic to our situation, and they see it very clearly. It's not like the Americans who are looking at it, or the British
From the
are
colonial
pretty clouded
eyes.
from the colonial eyes.
Yeah.
These were ex-colonized people, many of them who actually were freedom fighters, who are now diplomats, and they see our situation. They go, "This is a open and shut case to them," and they said, if it ever comes up before some kind of vote before the United Nations General Assembly, they're with us. So what we're trying to do right now is really just to continue to tell our story and build that kind of a response, and meanwhile try to get the mechanics going so that we can bring it up before the General Assembly of the United Nations. Now, I got to remind our listeners, we're not trying to get the United Nations to make us a country. We're just trying to get them to tell the U.S. they have to back off.
And allow us to
allow
make
us
the
to make our
choice that
country.
we were always entitled to.
Right.
Yeah.
And to intervene on our behalf and just say, you have to allow Hawaii, and then I got to include Alaska because we've been working closely with them, to determine what they want to do. And meanwhile, we have a big task, of course, and that is to get over the hump in Hawaii of this indoctrination that has gone on for 100 years, that we're Native Hawaiians, that we're Americans, and try to get over that mindset. I must say that over the last 40 years, with the sovereignty movement, and before that, really the Hawaiian cultural renaissance, we've made a big step in getting toward the identity of who we are. So recently we've been trying to push that in Hawaii itself, and we had a resolution in the legislature on Hawaiian Nationals, saying Hawaiian Nationals are a lawful part of the residents or the population of the Hawaiian Islands.
That was very important in terms of, first was a waking up. I call it the recovery and rediscovery phase.
Right.
And then we went through what we call the mourning phase. And when you enter into the dreaming, then you begin reflecting back at the historical events, the recovery and rediscovery phase, and you ask new questions as you want to dream ahead. And the new question is, well, who are the Hawaiians?
Right.
And the resolution that you submitted to Fei Hanohano, there are these terms called Hawaiian Nationals. And when we started talking about this, then the Chinese were more willing to stand up and say, I'm a Hawaiian national, and I can trace my ancestry, and the Howlers and the Japanese and others.
That's right.
So they can all jump in. So I think the progress is being made. Oftentimes we become very frustrated because of the slowness of the progress. And I think you have very well described the two faces of the battle. One is here at home as we decolonize our own minds, and we try to describe or define that new society or the re-emerged nation that needs to be created or recreated, and on the international front, the work that is done there. One more thing, if I may interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Let us not forget that Kanaki, or New Caledonia, was re-inscribed on the list of places to be decolonized through the efforts of the General Assembly, where the governments voted to place them on the agenda.
And brought up by the Melanesian states, the Melanesian Spearhead Group that adopted this policy. They said Kanaki should be independent, or should have the choice. And so they started, and they actually were the ones that I believe it was the Melanesian Spearhead Group in conjunction with the Pacific Islands Forum, then requested the United Nations to consider the situation, and they voted yes.
Do you see any possibilities for Hawaii and its connection with the Pacific Forum?
Very much so. Yeah, again. The strategy is really to approach, again, the Melanesian Spearhead Group, because they have a little bit more flexibility and quite a bit more boldness in what they can do. And then they can take it to the Pacific Islands Forum.
I see.
Which there are people there who've already expressed an interest in supporting our cause.
And now we're finding that Pacific Islanders or Polynesians are also thinking about this independence as not being something that they should be afraid about. Well, what's happening in Samoa, occupied Samoa?
Okay, occupied Samoa, American Samoa, they're in the process of decolonization. That is, the United States has helped to introduce education and discussion on the future governance of American Samoa, along with Puerto Rico, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. They're all going through a several-year process of determining what they want to do with their countries. So, and they can have the choice between remaining a territory, becoming a domestic state of the U.S., or becoming independent. And independent has two forms, and one is total independence, and the other would be free association, which is what Micronesia had chosen some time ago.
The stumbling block for Hawaii and for Alaska, however, is this myth that once becoming a member of the Union of States of the United States, you're not allowed a divorce. How that myth came about, they anchor it in the Civil War.
That's right.
And yet we know that the Civil War itself has no basis in law to retain one. And we didn't join before the Civil War. Well, we came in after. We weren't parties in that. Yeah.
And we came in through the process established by the United Nations,
which was a violated process,
yes.
in essence, what we sometimes call a fraud.
Right.
Well, time is almost up. I only have 2 more minutes. I got to get out of here. I got to pull all my cameras out of
I'm
here.
sorry I was late.
No, that's okay. But there's always more opportunities, either by telephone or you coming in and joining us again. So I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Mahalo. Thank you for your program and all that you've been doing over the years. Just a tremendous amount of work that you've put.
Well, it's a pleasure, and especially seeing the kind of progress that you're making now. And sometimes I get very frustrated and all the work that we've done, but we are making progress, and I think it's very important that other people understand what's going on. I just got an email from someone I hadn't heard of for a long time saying thank you very much for bringing us news of what's happening in the international arena. And I think in that case I was talking about some of your efforts in the international arena. So you're coming back, joining us. People are very hungry to hear about your progress. So,
well, thank you. Mahalo.
Okay, and then we'll have you again. And to the rest of you, I want to thank you very much for joining me. This is Paul Kalainui. You have been listening to Brother Leon Seal.
Kaulana na pua o Hawaii, hope o ka aina, iki mai ka elele o ka loko ino, pala pala anunu me ka paka. Pane mai Hawaii moku o ke ave, koku ana honoa o Ilani, ka ko o mai kaua i o